Jordan Peterson is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto and rose to stardom not that long ago by misrepresenting the Act to amend the Canadian Human Rights Act and Criminal Code, also known as Bill C-16. For this he was rewarded with a lot of attention and since then has been fetishized as some kind of free speech martyr for standing up to the Canadian government, who wanted to open the gulags to people accidentally misgendering a person. With his recent best-selling book 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, he's also become the savior of disaffected young males with messy rooms. His main work, however, are his lectures, all of which can be found online, and have now also gathered a significant fan base.
You may not realize it, but you are currently funding some dangerous people. They are indoctrinating young minds throughout the West with their resentment-ridden ideology. They have made it their life's mission to undermine Western civilization itself, which they regard as corrupt, oppressive, and patriarchal. If you're a taxpayer, or paying for your kid's liberal arts degree, you're underwriting this gang of nihilists. You're supporting ideologues who claim that all truth is subjective, that all sex differences are socially constructed, and that Western imperialism is the sole source of all third world problems. They are the postmodernists.
I have wanted to make a response to Jordan Peterson on postmodernism for a while now, but I have always found it very difficult. Mostly because he rarely refers to specific things postmodernist philosophers have said, or rarely distinguishes between them. Derrida, Foucault, Lyotard, Baudrillard, Deleuze, all of these philosophers typically placed in the postmodern camp have very different ideas, and if you make generalized statements about them, it is very hard to respond without knowing which specific philosopher you are talking about. After a while of watching videos by him, I identified a few points about postmodernism that he makes repeatedly, because Peterson's misrepresentations are too influential to be ignored.
In brief, I think what they did was, in the late 60s and early 70s, they were avowed Marxists, way after anyone with any shred of ethical decency had stopped being a Marxist. By that time, even Jean-Paul Sartre had woken up enough to figure out that the Soviets hadn't ushered in the kingdom of heaven. No, he had
I will get this one out of the way first, since it's just a matter of empirical observation. Peterson makes this claim a few times. When no one could defend Marxism in academia anymore, to continue it, academics had to disguise it by inventing postmodernism. This is demonstrably false. In this video, Peterson calls Derrida and Foucault the architects of postmodern philosophy. Foucault's first major work, Madness and Civilization, was published in 1961. Derrida's first major work of grammatology was published in 1967. Both of these works contain some of the main principles of their philosophies, such as a critique of historical method and analysis of power relations for Foucault, and deconstruction for Derrida. This was before the French riots of 1968, in which many leading protesters were self-avowed Marxists. These strikes, protests, and riots had 22% of the French population involved. In 1969, the French Communist Party received 4.8 million votes. It was the third largest party in all of France. At the same time, Italy's second largest party was the Italian Communist Party, receiving 8.5 million votes, remaining the second largest party in the next election of 1972 as well. And here I am only going by parliamentary statistics. Many Marxist parties are non-parliamentary out of principle. What I'm saying is the communist movement in Europe was alive during the birth of postmodern philosophy, including many prominent Marxist academics. There was absolutely no reason for academics to disavow Marxism while secretly still believing in it.
They transformed the Marxist dialogue of rich versus poor into oppressed versus oppressor. The postmodernist types is they're nested inside Marxism. So what they did instead, being highly intelligent individuals, was play a game of sleight of hand and transformed these Marxist presuppositions into postmodernism in the 1970s. The sleight of hand was, oh, well, fine, we'll just play a different oppressor versus oppressed game, and we'll introduce identity politics.
Peterson claims that postmodernism is Marxism in disguise because all it did was take Marxist class conflict and replace the rich and the poor with the oppressed and the oppressor in general. This is nonsensical because it assumes that a sufficient condition for being a Marxist is simply believing in a conflict between the rich and the poor, which anyone with a minimal understanding of Marxist theory will know is inaccurate. Are the liberals who identify a conflict between the 99% and the 1% Marxists as well? Secondly, he maintains that since postmodernists replaced rich versus poor with oppressor versus oppressed, this remained Marxism, which essentially means that according to Peterson, any ideology involving group conflict is Marxist. Does the fact that during feudal times liberals fought the monarchy because they saw it as oppressive mean that they were Marxists? Does the fact that fascist ideology identifies elements in society that oppress healthy life mean that they are Marxists too? No, of course not. Marxism has certain necessary tenets. The postmodern philosopher Baudrillard, who, unlike Foucault and Derrida, actually frequently use the word postmodernism, did not even see class conflict as today's fundamental conflict. Okay, so then Peterson goes on talking about how postmodernists sometimes criticize scientific practice, which he takes to mean that they reject science as such, and then goes on to say that social justice warriors own iPhones even though they require quantum mechanics to be made, and this is another example of him trying to tie Derrida and Foucault into something completely unrelated.
And it's a rare, bloody social justice warrior that doesn't have an iPhone or an Android that wouldn't work if quantum mechanics wasn't actually correct, because the fact...
The next substantial claim he makes is this.
So anyways, the worldview of the postmodern neo-Marxists is that everybody is basically not an individual, because that's really a fiction, and it's a Eurocentric patriarchal fiction at that, but a member of whatever their identity group happens to be, and there's no real possibility of communication between identity groups, hence phenomena like cultural appropriation. And so it's a war of all groups against all groups, and it's nothing but a struggle for power, and there's no higher order.
Okay, so there's a few things to unravel here. First off, he equates postmodernists with neo-Marxists, which, going back to my earlier points, makes no sense. He admits that postmodernists don't believe in overarching narratives, but calls them neo-Marxists. But neo-Marxists do believe in overarching narratives, so there's a contradiction there. Anyway, his claim is that according to postmodernists, the individual doesn't exist. This is not true. What is true is that they criticize the notion that the individual subject is a simple, rationally autonomous, and transparent thinking being. Peterson has a misunderstanding of postmodern philosophers at a very basic level, the kind that could be fixed by reading an introductory book or two. Clearly he is not stupid. If he really wanted to, he could develop an actual understanding of Derrida and Foucault. Certainly so if I could. I do not know if he is unwilling to learn because of his biases, or if he knows he is wrong and is simply lying, but in either case the effect is the same. Peterson's attempt to paint postmodernism as Marxism in disguise makes absolutely no sense theoretically, but in terms of his intentions, it makes perfect sense. It functions similarly to a term like cultural Marxism, because it throws together a whole bunch of different ideas into one big pile, from Marxism-Leninism to critical theory, to post-structuralism, to intersectional feminism, and labels all of it bad in a single motion. By pretending that all of these very different movements have the same origin and the same intent, one avoids the hard work of actually engaging with the theory, and simplifies the world to the point where it can identify a single main enemy that prevents the status quo from being as good as it otherwise would be. In other words, pure ideology. People have been asking me to respond to this book, Explaining Postmodernism by Stephen Hicks. This is the main source of Peterson's critique, and he has publicly recommended this book.
I want to recommend a book first to everyone here. It's called Explaining Postmodernism.
Explaining Postmodernism has a main thesis. The failure of epistemology made postmodernism possible, and the failure of socialism made postmodernism necessary. The very first page of the first chapter lists what Hicks takes to be the main postmodernist thinkers. This is important and, in my opinion, a useful approach. Postmodernism as a label has been used to designate a large number of different thinkers, and Hicks listing who he takes to be the main ones gives us a working idea of the focus of his critique. The four leading strategists that Hicks names are Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, and Rorty. At the very beginning, however, there's a problem. He lists Catherine MacKinnon and Andrea Dworkin as postmodernists. So already on the first page, while listing what he perceives to be postmodernism's main theorists, he, with no explanation, lists two women who are critics of postmodernism. I looked into all of Hicks's sources, and none of them imply in any way that Dworkin and MacKinnon are postmodernists. So my only guess then, if it's not just sloppy research on Hicks's part, is that he is willfully trying to conflate postmodernism with radical feminism. This would also explain what happens on page 17. In describing postmodernist education, he says that according to postmodernists, quote, postmodern education should emphasize works not in the canon. It should focus on the achievements of non-whites, females, and the poor. It should highlight the historical crimes of whites, males, and the rich. And it should teach students that science's method has no better claim to yielding truth than any other method. To support this claim, he cites a work by Chandra, Talpade, Mohanty. Now, already such a sweeping claim would need more sources than the statements of a single, quite marginal professor. But what's more is I looked into her lectures, and they have no connections with postmodernism. She is a post-colonial feminist. Now, even if Hicks wanted to equate postmodernism with feminism, he could have at least cited postmodern feminists, but he didn't. Whether willful or not, this can just be dismissed as a mistake, but the sloppy scholarship doesn't end there. Already in the second page, Stephen Hicks attributes this quote to Foucault: "It is meaningless to speak in the name of or against reason, truth, or knowledge." Well, Foucault never said that. On page 131, he attributes this quote to Hitler. Basically, National Socialism and Marxism are the same. That's a straight-up fabricated quote. On page 3, we see the first instance of a very basic misreading. Quoting Lyotard on the equation of power and reason, he says that, quote, postmodernism then becomes an activist strategy against a coalition of reason and power. This misunderstands what Lyotard, like Foucault saying that power and knowledge are inseparable, implies. It's not that the coalition between reason and power must be fought against. It is inevitable. It is inherent to both knowledge and power, and this is not an inherently bad thing. An even worse misreading appears on the very next page. Here, Hicks quotes Lyotard again, where Lyotard says that, quote, Saddam Hussein is a product of Western departments of state and big companies. This, of course, refers to the fact that during the war between Iran and Iraq, the US sent billions of dollars in economic aid to Hussein's government, and as was reported on ABC in '92, the Reagan/Bush administrations permitted and frequently encouraged the flow of money, agricultural credits, dual-use technology, chemicals, and weapons to Iraq. However, Hicks interprets this as saying that, quote, Hussein is a victim and a spokesman for victims of American imperialism the world over. This can't even just be a misunderstanding on Hicks's part. Lyotard never even calls Hussein a victim, or any equivalent, let alone calling him a spokesman of victims the world over. It's genuinely baffling how Hicks even managed to come to this characterization from the quote he used, unless he tried to misrepresent it deliberately. I'm not actively trying to find things to nitpick here. On the first 4 consecutive pages of the book, we already find a misattributed quote, a misreading, and a miscategorization. This is how he characterizes deconstructive literary criticism. Quote, the task of the literary critic, accordingly, is to deconstruct the text to reveal the author's race, sex, or class interests. And further, literary criticism becomes a form of subjective play in which the reader pours subjective associations into the text. Hicks doesn't provide any sources for these claims, so I don't know where he got this from. Maybe he's referring to some deconstructive method I don't know about, but that's pretty much the opposite of how Derrida, the father of deconstruction of course, conceived of deconstruction. A basic tenet of deconstruction is that you don't bring anything into the text from the outside. Instead, you examine the internal logic of the text. You find tensions in the text using only the tools provided by the text itself. Instead of critiquing it from the outside or from a bird's eye perspective, you examine it from the inside. The pouring in of subjective associations is precisely what this prevents. As Professor Jack Reynolds says in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, deconstruction is committed to the rigorous analysis of the literal meaning of a text, and yet also to finding within that meaning, perhaps in the neglected corners of the text, including the footnotes, internal problems that actually point towards alternative meanings. And Derrida himself identifies his deconstructive strategy with a, quote, desire to be faithful to the themes and audacities of a thinking. Later, on page 190, Hicks says, quote, deconstruction allows you to dismiss whole literary and legal traditions as built upon sexist or racist or otherwise exploitative assumptions. It provides a justification for setting them aside. This completely contradicts the deep respect Derrida exhibited for the Western canon, and his entire bibliography emerged in dialogue with Western classics. This stereotype is generally strange because postmodern philosophers have often drawn from books within the Western canon for insights and sources of inspiration. Often, Hicks puts forth misrepresentations and misreadings so common and cliched that you can watch decades-old lectures and feel like they're directly responding to Stephen Hicks. We'll get back to postmodernism, but for now, let's go to Chapter 2, where Hicks starts his broad historical account of the Counter-Enlightenment, starting with Kant. Yes, you heard me right. The Counter-Enlightenment starting with Kant. This is where his gross misrepresentations of modern philosophy begin. In What is Enlightenment, Kant wrote that the Enlightenment is man's release from self-incurred tutelage, the overcoming of man's inability to make use of his understanding without direction from another. So, on what basis does Hicks consider Kant to be a counter-Enlightenment philosopher? Well, he says that Kant attacked Enlightenment reason, that Kant concluded that objectivity must be abandoned, and that our reason is limited to structuring our subjective creations. Now, anyone who has read any book by Kant will know how absurd these accusations are. First of all, saying that Kant rejected objectivity is really strange considering his entire epistemological project was an attempt to ground objective knowledge in the face of Hume's skepticism. To say that Kant is against reason makes no sense considering to what extent he utilized reason and clarified its conditions and praised it in his works. And to say that for Kant our reason is limited to structuring our subjective creations is flat out false, because Kant very clearly stated that what our categories of understanding structure is not subjective creations, but sensory data given to us by the thing in itself, which is Kant's term for external things outside of relations to human subjects. On page 41, he says that, quote, the key point about Kant is that he prohibits knowledge of anything outside of our skulls. Again, this is flat out wrong. Our skulls, as well as the empirical world in which they exist, are possible objects of experience, and therefore, for Kant, are subject to scientific, empirical, and objective inquiry. Kant made it pretty clear that he was an empirical realist. On page 51, he says that Kierkegaard, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche all shared a contempt for reason. Again, no source for this claim, of course. No matter that Schopenhauer's doctoral dissertation was on the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, in which he tried to clarify the necessary conditions of reason, which he saw all knowledge as subject to, whether empirical, logical, geometrical, or psychological. And Nietzsche was, of course, a brilliant philologist and scholar. Apparently, he somehow achieved this with contempt for reason. And if you're suspecting that I'm criticizing Hicks's account of the history of philosophy because of some ulterior political motives, you can look even at the 2 reviews of this book from the right libertarian Mises Institute, which is in line with Hicks politically. David Gordon called Hicks's account of Kant not only disputable but altogether mistaken, and aspects of his account of history eminently questionable. While Marcus Verheg, I'm sorry, I have no idea how to pronounce that, calls his historical account too caricatured and sacrificing, quote, too much for a simple on-message presentation. Hicks equates all non-realist philosophical theories with the counter-enlightenment and anti-reason. Again, a completely unwarranted equation. By making this equation, Hicks effectively condemns the majority of Western philosophers as being anti-reason. The history of Western philosophy then appears to him as almost one big continuous attack on reason and objectivity. One even wonders then why Hicks criticizes postmodernists' supposed disrespect for the Western canon when he doesn't seem to have much love for it himself. This is also why it's actually strange that Jordan Peterson recommended this book. First of all, Two of Peterson's main influences are Nietzsche and Jung, both thinkers who believe that reason does not exhaustively explain or make sense of the world. Additionally, Peterson has explicitly said that he subscribes to a pragmatist theory of knowledge, which is a non-realist theory. Because of these two things then, Stephen Hicks's standards would definitively place Peterson in the anti-reason, anti-objectivity, counter-enlightenment camp. Have you noticed what Stephen Hicks has managed to do here? Under the guise of simply explaining postmodernism or giving a historical account of its development, he actually smuggles in very specific opinions on metaphysics, epistemology, history, and politics as the only ones that are pro-reason and pro-objectivity. He has managed to do this while still having the people he implicitly terms as anti-reason promote his book. Therefore, not only is this book politically charged, as I said earlier, it attempts to promote a very narrow conception of what is reasonable in philosophy. And of course, what is reasonable coincides with everything that Stephen Hicks believes.
There's one thing that stands out when talking about Jordan Peterson's fan base, and that sometimes earns him some uncomfortable questions.
Maximoff says, thoughts on the Jews. Thoughts on the Jews. Okay, all right, what the hell? Address the Jewish question. That's a hell of a thing to ask.
Could Jewish individuals use their position of power to seek out revenge that have a history of expelling Jews?
Hold it.
He seems to attract a lot of people from the fringes of the right, although he is very opposed to the political views of said fringes. His, let's say, more moderate fan base seems to have no answer for why that is, and often claims that if anything, Peterson has a moderating effect on people with extremist views, pulling them more to the center. There is a very popular clip making the rounds, which has gathered around 2.3 million views by now, and is titled How Hitler Was Even More Evil Than You Think. The clip is taken from a longer lecture called Maps of Meaning 11, The Flood and the Tower. In this lecture, he tackles the Nazis' motivation for the Holocaust and gives his own perspective on the matter. So we'll look at how he is wrong from a historical perspective and why his conclusion is actually dangerous. Let's listen to the clip, shall we?
So here's what you should have done if you were a Nazi and you wanted to win the war. You should have enslaved the Jews and the Gypsies and had them work, right? You should have had them work for the benefit of the victory, and then if you wanted to, you liquidate them afterward. And we assume that Hitler wanted to win. He wasn't exactly a good guy, so why should we assume that he was aiming at the good that he was promoting, even in his own terms, right? The glorious, everlasting Third Reich. So what do you do with the Jews and the Gypsies? Well, round them up, fine. Enslave them, fine. You don't kill them. You certainly don't devote a substantial proportion of your war resources while you're losing to accelerate the rate at which the extermination is taking place. Because that's a bit counterproductive, unless what you're aiming at is the maximum possible mayhem in the shortest period of time.
Later in the video, he cites Jung, of course, to make the point that sometimes in order to infer the motivations for an action, one needs to look at the outcome of an action.
There's an old psychoanalytic idea. I think this was derived by Jung. If you can't figure out what someone is doing or why, look at the outcome and infer the motivation.
That's not really what historians investigating the Nazis and the Third Reich, or any period for that matter, do. Not just because not every action might produce the outcome desired by the historical actor, but also because, and this is something where Peterson should probably have listened to some postmodern theorists if he had read them, presents the massive danger of projecting your own cultural and social assumptions and rationalities back onto historical actors who, due to difference in historically formed discourse, might operate under entirely different assumptions and rationalities. Case in point, Jordan Peterson asserts that in order to win the war, it would have been more beneficial to round up and enslave Jews and so-called gypsies rather than to kill them. This represents a fairly abhorrent application of capitalist logic of valorization and exploitation. Leaving aside for now that the Nazis did exactly that in addition to mass murder, the problem begins when Peterson juxtaposes this supposedly fine logic with what he asserts the Nazis' real motive for their actions was: mayhem and getting into the metaphysical Jungian drivel, the mark of Cain.
Or are we going to attribute to Hitler the highest possible motives? Say, no, it's an archetypal manifestation of Cain. Now, he's going to put up a front that says, well, I'm your savior. It's like, well, destructive people think that Cain is their savior.
Rather than mayhem or any sort of metaphysical manifestation of evil, the Nazis are relatively straightforward in telling us their base assumptions upon which their actions and logic is based. It's not mayhem, but rather the idea that the prime objective is the removal, up to and including physical extermination, of Jews and so-called gypsies from the world. Winning the war for the Nazi leadership and the German state at the time means achieving that goal. War, German military theorist Karl von Clausewitz wrote, is the extension of politics by other means. This dictum is as true for the Nazis as it is for virtually every other war of the 19th and 20th century. Nazi politics and ideology is built around one core assumption about the nature of society, the state and history. That all of history, including all social formations, are built around a biological conflict between races. With the most prominent actors on the stage being the German or Aryan race, which represents order, progress and civilization, and the alleged Jewish race, which represents chaos, decadence, decay and destruction. Since in the Nazi worldview all of history revolves around this conflict, so does necessarily the Second World War and the conception of what a German victory looks like in this conflict. Even with the war itself becoming an important catalyst in radicalizing German policy, from discrimination, forced immigration and ghettoization to actual physical extermination of Jews. The reason this is so important, and why Jordan Peterson's musings on Nazism are so objectionable, is by understanding that the Nazis' actions followed a rationality derived from their basic assumptions about the world. We are able to grasp the destructive force of racist and anti-Semitic ideology, of a conspiratorial worldview that is centered around the charge of a group wishing to destroy our values, our way of life. By simply ascribing the Nazis' actions to a wish to cause mayhem, to the mark of Cain, their actions are exterritorialized from history. Nazis were the result of a concrete worldview. A worldview not too dissimilar to that Jordan Peterson and other figures the far-right flocks to are trying to peddle today. If, like Peterson, people perceive the world in a way that posits certain behaviors, attitude and social positions of certain people as primordial, like for instance Peterson claims in his book 12 Rules for Life in stating, culture is symbolically, archetypically, mythically male, chaos the unknown is symbolically associated with the feminine, and further asserts that there are certain groups that are trying to disrupt the natural order of things with a nefarious agenda.
Everything that's been established since the Enlightenment, rationality, empiricism, science, everything, clarity of mind, dialogue, the idea of the individual, all of that, it's to be destroyed. That's the goal.
Even going as far as to claim this supposed group isn't even interested in talking to you.
You see, and this is no aberration that these people don't engage in dialogue. It's no aberration. It's built right into the philosophical system. If I even engage in the dialogue, I'm playing your game, you win.
Then conditions brought about by social change, political unrest or even war can quickly lead to a political program that, like the Nazis, asserts that the only solution to this problem is for these groups not to live in this world anymore, and to use coercion to assert the natural state of things.
We're going to talk about lobsters! So this first chapter, Stand Up Straight with Your Shoulders Back, is the famous lobster chapter. Of course, if you've seen Jordan Peterson, you know that he's affiliated with lobsters. You might be wondering, why?
Where's that meme come from? It's because the first chapter of his book is about lobsters.
Yeah, basically what Jordan is going to do throughout this chapter is he's going to spell out sort of the hierarchical social structure of lobsters, and then he's going to try and say human beings operate on that same level. Therefore, if you want to succeed as an individual, you should look at lobsters and sort of what lessons you can learn from them about being a more dominant individual.
Lobsters, but like it's not a joke. Like I had heard this initially and thought, okay, it's a quick metaphor. Before I read the book, it's probably just like a paragraph or something where he says, okay, lobsters have this society, whatever, and then he goes on and talks about the rest of it. No, the lobsters pervade the entire chapter. I mean, they're in the whole thing.
This is something that's going to happen several times throughout this book. This is something Jordan Peterson and people like him do a lot, actually.
Yeah.
In this particular case, it's an appeal to the natural. Things are the way they are because they should be the way they are and that hierarchy is good. So in order to defend that statement, he looks to something in nature, the specific lobster example that we're going to go into in detail, and says, look, this is model of reality that I have closely resembles this thing I can point to in nature, therefore my worldview is the correct one because I can point to a thing in nature that somewhat resembles it.
He doesn't even dance around it. This is a direct quote. He being a male lobster that displays dominance in this scenario, also gets all the girls. It is exponentially more worthwhile to be successful if you are a lobster and male. And then he will directly go into paragraphs about how that equally extrapolates to men, and how women will seek out that aspect.
Even in situations that don't extend beyond the sexual, it's still he still puts this hierarchy above everything. It's why everything in every relationship is so defined by this. For instance, this part. Over the millennia, animals who must cohabitate with the others in the same territories have in consequence learned many tricks to establish dominance, while risking the least amount of possible damage. A defeated wolf, for example, will roll over on its back, exposing their throat to the victor, who will not then deign to tear it out. The now dominant wolf may still require a future hunting partner after all, even one as pathetic as his now defeated foe. I like that he also throws the pathetic in there. Fucking beta cuck wolf.
Yeah, I mean, he's using language that he knows his audience will eat up a little bit because they see themselves as the alpha wolf. He doesn't use a wolf on accident here.
The common misconception about alpha wolf and, being subordinate, that's, not how actual wolf packs work in reality.
Again, implying that anything that is in fact natural is inherently virtuous or good or beneficial, which is not the case, considering this planet tries to kill us constantly, and he brings that up.
He actually goes in and says, if a dominant lobster is badly deflated, its brain basically dissolves. It then grows a new subordinate's brain, one more appropriate to its new lowly position. His citation to a paper, and I actually went and read the paper. The paper doesn't say that. That is from The Effects of Social Experience on Serotonergic Modulation of the Escape Circuit of Crayfish.
Crayfish,
yes.
Not lobster.
And
similar. I will grant that the crayfish are similar to lobsters, not lobsters.
It doesn't do that at fucking all.
He agrees with this form because it happens to line up with his other conservative worldviews. It's not true because it's been vetted. It's true because it lines up with his idea of what truth is.
Instead of undertaking the computationally difficult task of identifying the best man, the females outsource the problem to the machine-like calculations of the dominance hierarchy. They let the males fight it out and peel their paramours from the top. This is very much what happens with stock market pricing, where the value of any particular enterprise is determined through competition of all. Are you telling me Jordan Peterson's view of the world is somewhat simplistic and is not reflective of the reality in which we live?
Yeah, I can back that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm Hugo.
And I'm Jake.
Jordan B. Movie Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos.